You have exactly 30 seconds to get out of this house before I call the police. My Aunt Vivian's manicured finger pointed at the door like a weapon, her Botox-frozen face somehow managing to convey pure hatred as 53 mourners in black turned to stare at me. I stood in my grandmother's living room, still wearing the discount dress I had bought for the funeral, still clutching the single white rose I had planned to place on her casket, when the family lawyer walked in and said 7 words that would change everything. Everyone except Madeline needs to leave now. My name is Madeline Harper, and this is the story of how my grandmother's death revealed the truth about the family who had spent 26 years trying to erase me. I need to take you back to the beginning, to a small hospital room in Cedar Falls, Iowa, where a teenage girl gave birth to a baby she wasn't allowed to keep. My mother, Sarah Harper, was 17 years old when she got pregnant with me. She was the youngest daughter of Eleanor and Richard Whitmore, one of the wealthiest families in the state. The Whitmores had built their fortune through a chain of agricultural supply companies that stretched across the Midwest, and they had spent 3 generations cultivating a reputation for conservative values and Christian charity. An unwed teenage mother did not fit into that image. According to the story I pieced together over the years, my grandmother Eleanor had wanted to help my mother. She had suggested taking a year off, having the baby quietly, perhaps arranging a private adoption with a good family. But my grandfather Richard and my Aunt Vivian had other ideas. "She's made her bed," Vivian reportedly said at the family meeting where my mother's fate was decided. "If she wants to keep this bastard child, she can do it somewhere else. I won't have our family name dragged through the mud." Vivian was 25 at the time, already married to a wealthy banker named Theodore Ashworth, already positioning herself as the heir apparent to the Whitmore legacy. My mother's pregnancy was an inconvenience, a threat to the family's standing in their tight-knit community. So they gave my mother a choice: give up the baby and stay, or keep the baby and leave. My mother chose me. She was cut off completely. No money, no support, no contact. She moved to Minneapolis with nothing but a suitcase and a high school diploma, worked 3 jobs to put herself through community college, and raised me in a series of small apartments where love was abundant but money was always tight. She never spoke badly about her family. That was the remarkable thing about my mother. Even after everything they had done to her, she refused to poison me against them. "Your grandmother is a good woman," she would tell me when I was young and asking questions about why I didn't have grandparents like other kids. "She's just trapped. Trapped by people who are afraid of anything that doesn't fit their perfect picture." Will I ever meet her? My mother would get a faraway look in her eyes. "I hope so, sweetheart. I really hope so." I was 8 years old when my mother died. It was a car accident, the kind of random, senseless tragedy that destroys lives without warning or reason. A drunk driver ran a red light at 2:37 a.m. while my mother was driving home from her night shift at the hospital where she worked as a nurse's aide. She died on impact. I was told she didn't suffer, though I've never been sure if that was true, or just something adults say to make death easier for children to accept. I had no other family. At least, none that wanted me. My grandmother Eleanor reached out to social services after my mother's death. I learned this years later, from documents I wasn't supposed to see. She had wanted to take me in, to raise me as her own. But Vivian and my grandfather had blocked it, threatening to cut Eleanor off from the family fortune if she brought that girl into their home. Eleanor was 63 years old and had never worked a day in her life. She had no money of her own, no skills, no independence. She was as trapped as my mother had said. So I went into the foster care system instead. I don't want to dwell on those years. They weren't all bad. I had some foster families who were kind, who tried their best. I had others who saw me as nothing more than a government check. I learned to be invisible, to take up as little space as possible, to expect nothing, so I would never be disappointed. I aged out of the system at 18 with a duffel bag, a GED, and a fierce determination to build a life that no one could ever take away from me. I worked my way through college, then graduate school. I became a social worker, specializing in helping kids in foster care because I knew what it felt like to be unwanted, and I wanted to make sure other children knew they weren't alone. I built a small but meaningful life in Chicago, with a modest apartment, a job I loved, and friends who had become my chosen family. I thought about the Whitmores sometimes, usually late at night when the loneliness crept in. I had looked them up online over the years, watched from a distance as my Aunt Vivian became a prominent socialite, as my cousins Bradley and Courtney grew up with every advantage I had been denied. I saw photos of family gatherings at the Whitmore estate, Christmas celebrations and summer barbecues, and I wondered what it would have been like to belong. But I never reached out. Pride, maybe. Or self-preservation. I had learned long ago that wanting things from people who didn't want you back was a recipe for heartbreak. Then, 6 months ago, I received a letter. It was handwritten, on cream-colored stationery, with the Whitmore family crest embossed at the top. The handwriting was shaky, clearly belonging to someone elderly, but the words were clear. My dearest Madeline, I have made many mistakes in my life, but none greater than letting you go. I was a coward, afraid of losing everything, and in my cowardice, I lost the one thing that truly mattered. Your mother was the bravest person I ever knew. She chose love over comfort, and she paid the price for it every day of her short life. I should have stood with her. I should have stood with you. I didn't, and I will carry that shame to my grave. I am dying. The doctors say I have perhaps 6 months, perhaps less. Before I go, I need you to know that I have never stopped loving you, never stopped thinking about you, never stopped regretting what I allowed to happen. I am not asking for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I am asking for a chance to see you, just once before I die. I need to look into your eyes and tell you myself that you were always wanted, always loved, even when I was too weak to show it. Please, Madeline. Please come. Your grandmother, Eleanor. I stared at that letter for 3 days before I responded. Part of me wanted to throw it away, to protect myself from another disappointment. But a larger part, the part that still remembered my mother's voice saying, "Your grandmother is a good woman," couldn't ignore the desperation in those words. I wrote back. I said I would come. 2 weeks later, I drove to Cedar Falls for the first time in my life. The Whitmore estate was everything I had imagined and more. A sprawling Victorian mansion sat on 50 acres of manicured grounds, with a private lake, guest houses, and gardens that looked like they belonged in a magazine. It was the kind of wealth I had only seen in movies, the kind of generational fortune that created its own gravity, pulling everything and everyone into its orbit. My grandmother was waiting for me on the front porch. She was 84 years old, frail and thin, her white hair pulled back in an elegant bun. But her eyes, when they met mine, were sharp and alive, filled with an emotion I couldn't quite name. "Madeline," she said, and her voice broke on my name. "You look just like her. Just like Sarah." I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to feel. 26 years of abandonment and resentment warred with something softer, something that recognized in this old woman the grandmother I had always wanted. "Hello," I managed. I'm here." Eleanor laughed, a sound that was half sob. "Yes, you are. Finally. Finally you're here." That first visit lasted 3 hours. We sat in her private sitting room, away from the rest of the family, and she told me everything. The fights she had lost, the compromises she had made, the guilt that had eaten at her for decades. She showed me photos of my mother that I had never seen, letters Sarah had written that Eleanor had kept hidden in a locked drawer. Vivian intercepted most of them, Eleanor admitted, her voice bitter. She made sure I never knew where Sarah was, never had a way to contact her. By the time I found out about the accident, you had already been placed in foster care. I tried, Madeline. I want you to believe that I tried. But you didn't try hard enough, I said quietly. Eleanor closed her eyes, and a tear slipped down her weathered cheek. "No, I didn't. And I have no excuse except cowardice. I chose comfort over courage, and you paid the price. I wanted to hate her. Part of me did hate her, would probably always hate her a little for the childhood I had lost. But sitting there, watching this dying woman confront her failures with raw honesty, I found that hatred wasn't the only thing I felt. I can't forgive you, I said finally. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But I can try to understand." Eleanor reached out and took my hand, her grip surprisingly strong. That's more than I deserve. Thank you, Madeline. Thank you for coming. Over the next 5 months, I visited my grandmother as often as I could. I used all my vacation days, drove 8 hours round trip on weekends, rearranged my entire life to spend time with a woman I was only just beginning to know. We talked for hours. She told me stories about my mother as a child, about the grandmother I had never known, about the history of the family I had been erased from. I told her about my life, my work, my dreams. For the first time, I felt like I had a connection to my past, a root system that grounded me in something larger than myself. But our meetings were always secret. Eleanor insisted on it. Vivian can never know, she said repeatedly. Not until it's time. She would find a way to stop this, to poison what we're building. Promise me, Madeline. Promise me you'll wait. I didn't understand what she meant by until it's time, but I promised. I should have realized she was planning something. My grandmother died on a Tuesday in October, peacefully in her sleep, with a nurse by her side and a photo of my mother clutched in her hand. I received the call at 6 a.m., and I drove to Cedar Falls one final time, not knowing what to expect but knowing I needed to be there. The funeral was scheduled for 3 days later. I wasn't included in the planning, wasn't consulted about the arrangements, wasn't even officially notified. I found out the details through the obituary in the local newspaper, the same way a stranger would. But I went anyway. I had promised my grandmother I would be there at the end, and I intended to keep that promise. The funeral was held at the Whitmore estate, in the grand ballroom that had hosted generations of family celebrations. Over 50 people attended, dressed in expensive black, murmuring condolences and calculating inheritances in the same breath. I stood in the back, trying to be invisible, clutching my single white rose and waiting for the service to end so I could say my private goodbye. That's when Vivian spotted me. My aunt had aged well, if you considered well, to mean expensively preserved. At 61, she had the taut, frozen face of a woman who had waged war against time with every weapon money could buy. Her black Chanel suit probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her pearls were undoubtedly real. And her eyes, when they landed on me, held all the warmth of a January blizzard. What are you doing here? The murmurs stopped. 53 heads turned in my direction. I came to pay my respects, I said quietly. Eleanor was my grandmother. Vivian's laugh was sharp and cruel. Grandmother? You have no grandmother here. You're nothing but the bastard child of a disgrace my mother should have forgotten decades ago. Vivian. Someone started, but she cut them off with a wave of her hand. No. I've tolerated this family's sentimentality long enough. Mother is gone now, and I won't have her funeral tainted by this intruder. She stepped closer, her heels clicking on the marble floor like a countdown. You have exactly 30 seconds to get out of this house before I call the police. I stood frozen, humiliation burning through me. I could feel the stares, some pitying, some curious, some openly hostile. My cousins Bradley and Courtney stood behind their mother, arms crossed, nodding in agreement. Theodore, Vivian's husband, was examining his cufflinks as if this was all too boring to engage with. I should have left. The old Madeline, the foster child who had learned to take up as little space as possible, would have left. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I'm not leaving, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. I have as much right to be here as anyone. Vivian's eyes narrowed. You have no rights here. You're not in the will. You're not part of this family. You're nothing but a reminder of a mistake my sister made, and I will not allow you to. Excuse me. A new voice cut through the confrontation. Everyone turned to see a man in his 60s stepping forward, a leather briefcase in one hand and a manila envelope in the other. He had the calm, deliberate demeanor of someone accustomed to delivering life-changing news. My name is Harold Finch. I was Eleanor Whitmore's personal attorney for the past 32 years. I apologize for the interruption, but given the circumstances, I believe it's time to proceed with the reading of the will. Vivian's face shifted from anger to anticipation, then to something like triumph. Of course, Mr. Finch. We can continue in the study. Family only, naturally. She shot me a pointed look. Which means you can see yourself out. Harold Finch cleared his throat. Actually, Mrs. Ashworth, I must insist that everyone except Ms. Madeline Harper leave the room. The silence that followed was absolute. I beg your pardon? Vivian's voice was ice. Eleanor Whitmore's final will and testament names Madeline Harper as the primary beneficiary. The reading of the will is to be conducted privately, with Ms. Harper alone, before any other bequests are announced. Harold looked around the room with an expression of polite steel. I must ask everyone else to please step outside. Refreshments have been arranged in the garden. No one moved. There must be some mistake, Vivian said, her voice rising. I've been managing Mother's affairs for 15 years. I know exactly what's in that will. The estate is divided between myself and the children. That's what we agreed. That's what she promised. Promises made under duress are not legally binding, Mrs. Ashworth. Harold's voice was pleasant but firm. Eleanor Whitmore updated her will 6 months ago, with new witnesses and complete legal oversight. I assure you, there is no mistake. 6 months ago? Vivian's eyes snapped to me, and I saw understanding dawn, followed immediately by fury. You did this. You manipulated a dying old woman, poisoned her against her own family. Mrs. Ashworth, I must insist you lower your voice. This is, after all, a funeral. Harold gestured toward the door. Please. The garden. Now. For a moment I thought Vivian might actually refuse. Her face had gone purple with rage, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. But Harold Finch had clearly dealt with people like her before. He simply waited, patient and immovable, until the social pressure of 53 witnesses became too much to ignore. This isn't over, Vivian hissed at me as she swept past. I'll contest this in every court in the country. I'll destroy you. That is, of course you're right, Harold replied mildly. Though I should mention that Eleanor anticipated such a response and made provisions. But we can discuss that later. The room emptied slowly, mourners filing out with backward glances and whispered speculation. Bradley and Courtney looked shocked, their privileged certainty crumbling. Theodore was already on his phone, presumably calling a lawyer. Only when the last person had left and the heavy oak doors had closed behind them did Harold turn to me. Miss Harper, please. Sit down. We have much to discuss. I sank into a velvet armchair, my legs suddenly unsteady. I don't understand. My grandmother never mentioned, she never said anything about a will. Harold smiled gently. Eleanor was many things, but she was not a fool. She knew that if Vivian discovered her plans prematurely, there would be interference. Threats. Perhaps even an attempt to have her declared mentally incompetent. So she kept her own counsel, planned meticulously, and waited. He opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick document, the official seal of the state of Iowa stamped across the top. The last will and testament of Eleanor Grace Whitmore, he read. Dated April 15th of this year, witnessed by myself and 2 independent notaries, with a full psychological evaluation confirming mental competency attached. He flipped through several pages before stopping and looking up at me. I'll spare you the legal language and summarize. Eleanor has left you everything. The room tilted. Everything. The Whitmore estate, valued at approximately $47 million, including all properties, investments, and business holdings. The family home and its contents. Her personal jewelry collection, appraised at $3.2 million. And controlling interest in Whitmore Agricultural Supply, which, as of last quarter, was valued at approximately $180 million. I couldn't breathe. I literally could not draw air into my lungs. That's not possible, I whispered. We only knew each other for 5 months. She couldn't have. Harold reached into his briefcase again and withdrew a sealed envelope, my name written on the front in my grandmother's shaky handwriting. She asked me to give you this. Perhaps it will help explain. I took the envelope with trembling hands and broke the seal. My dearest Madeline, if you're reading this, then I am gone, and Harold has told you what I've done. I imagine you're confused, perhaps even frightened. Let me try to explain. I have been a coward my entire life. I let my husband and daughter control me, manipulate me, use me as a prop in their performance of respectability. I watched them destroy my youngest child, your mother, and I did nothing. I let them erase you from our family, and I did nothing. I spent decades doing nothing while the people around me committed cruelty after cruelty, all in the name of protecting a legacy that was never worth protecting. I cannot undo what has been done. I cannot give you back your mother, your childhood, the family you deserved. But I can give you this: everything that should have been Sarah's, and through her, yours. Vivian and her children have had every advantage. They have been given wealth, education, opportunity. They have never wanted for anything, never struggled, never known what it means to be alone and afraid. And what have they done with these gifts? They have become cruel, entitled, hollow people who measure their worth in dollars and social standing. You, Madeline, had nothing. And yet you became something remarkable. A woman who helps children like yourself, who builds community from loneliness, who faces the world with courage and compassion despite every reason to become bitter. You are everything I hoped you would be, everything your mother dreamed you could become. The Whitmore legacy belongs to you now. Not because of blood or birthright, but because you are the only one who will use it for good. Vivian will fight you. She will call you a gold digger, a manipulator, a fraud. She will try to paint me as senile and you as predatory. Harold has prepared for this. Every document is ironclad. Every legal avenue has been secured. She can rage all she likes, but she cannot take what I have given you. There is, however, one more thing you should know. In my safe, behind the portrait of your great-grandmother in the study, you will find a box. Inside that box are documents I have collected over 30 years. Bank statements, emails, recordings, evidence of every crime, every betrayal, every act of cruelty that Vivian and her husband have committed in the name of the Whitmore family. Theodore has been embezzling from his bank for 15 years. Vivian has been blackmailing 3 separate families to maintain her social position. Together, they have defrauded the Whitmore Charitable Foundation of nearly $8 million, redirecting funds meant for sick children into their personal accounts. I could have exposed them years ago. I didn't because I was afraid. Afraid of the scandal, afraid of losing what little I had, afraid of being alone. But you, Madeline, are not afraid. You have been alone your whole life, and you survived. You thrived. Use what I've given you as you see fit. Expose them or don't. Forgive them or don't. Build the Whitmore name into something worthy, or burn it to the ground. The choice is yours. Just know that whatever you decide, I am proud of you. I have always been proud of you. And I am sorry, more sorry than words can express, that I didn't have the courage to tell you that when I was alive. I love you, Madeline. I have always loved you. Your grandmother, Eleanor. P.S. Don't feel guilty about the money. You've earned it by surviving them. And besides, the look on Vivian's face when she finds out will be worth every penny. I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face, before I could speak. She knew, I finally said. She knew everything they were doing, and she just waited. Harold nodded slowly. Eleanor Whitmore was not a perfect woman. She was, as she said, a coward in many ways. But in the end, she found her courage. She spent the last 6 months of her life making sure you would be protected, making sure Vivian couldn't touch you, making sure the truth would finally come to light. He handed me a tissue and waited while I composed myself. What happens now? I asked. Now we go outside and inform the family of the will's contents. Then, over the coming weeks, we begin the process of transferring assets. It will take some time. Estates of this size always do, but everything has been arranged. Vivian and her family will receive a small bequest, enough to maintain appearances, but nothing more. The bulk of the fortune is yours. And the documents in the safe? The evidence. Harold's expression was carefully neutral. That is entirely your decision. If you choose to pursue legal action, I can recommend several excellent attorneys. If you choose to use the information privately as leverage, that is also an option. Or you can destroy it all and start fresh, with no blood on your hands. I thought about Vivian, about the years of cruelty, about my mother dying alone because her family had abandoned her. I thought about the children whose charity money had been stolen, the families who had been blackmailed, all the victims of the Ashworth greed. I want to see the documents first, I said, before I decide anything. Of course. Shall we? We found the safe exactly where Eleanor had described, hidden behind a portrait that must have been worth a fortune on its own. Inside was a fireproof box, and inside that box were decades of carefully organized crimes. Bank statements showing wire transfers from Whitmore Charitable Foundation to shell companies controlled by Theodore. Emails discussing handling local reporters who got too curious. Recordings of Vivian threatening a business rival with exposure of an affair if he didn't withdraw from a contract negotiation. Documentation of falsified tax returns, bribed officials, ruined competitors. It was worse than I had imagined. Much worse. Your grandmother was thorough, Harold observed, flipping through the files. This is enough to send both of them to prison for decades. Why didn't she do anything? I asked more to myself than to him. All these years, all this evidence. Fear, Harold said simply. Dependency. The habits of a lifetime. Eleanor was not a strong woman, Miss Harper. She was a woman who made the wrong choices for the right reasons, and then spent the rest of her life living with the consequences. He looked at me. But she raised a strong granddaughter. Even from a distance. Even through your mother. Strength, it seems, skips a generation. I spent the next hour reviewing the documents, my mind churning through options and implications. By the time I emerged from the study, I had made my decision. The family was waiting in the garden, clustered in tense groups, conversations stopping abruptly when I appeared. Vivian stood at the center, like a general preparing for battle, her husband and children flanking her. Well, she demanded, has this farce gone on long enough? I assume you've realized you can't possibly get away with this. I walked toward her slowly, aware of every eye on me. The will is legitimate, I said calmly. I've inherited the estate, the businesses, and the controlling interest in Whitmore Agricultural Supply. Harold can provide you with copies of the documentation if you'd like to have your lawyers review it, but I'm told it's ironclad. Vivian's face contorted with rage. This is insane. You expect me to believe that my mother, in her final months of dementia. Eleanor passed a full psychological evaluation before signing the will. 3 independent doctors confirmed her mental competency. It's all documented. I don't care about documents, Vivian spat. You manipulated her. You preyed on a dying woman's guilt. I'll have this thrown out in every court. That's your right, I interrupted. But before you decide to pursue legal action, there's something you should know. I pulled a single sheet of paper from the folder I had brought outside. It was a summary document, listing the contents of the safe without revealing the actual evidence. Eleanor kept records, I said. Detailed records. Of everything. The embezzlement from the charitable foundation. The blackmail. The fraud. The bribery. Everything you and Theodore have done for the past 15 years. The color drained from Vivian's face. Theodore went gray. I don't know what you're talking about, Vivian said, but her voice had lost its edge. I think you do. I think you've always known that Eleanor was watching, collecting, waiting. You just assumed she was too weak to ever use it. I folded the paper and tucked it back into my folder. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to accept the will without contest. You're going to walk away from this estate with the bequest Eleanor left you, which is more than generous considering what you've done. And you're never going to contact me again. And if I refuse, then I give everything in that safe to the FBI, the IRS, and every newspaper in the state. You'll spend the rest of your lives in prison. Your children will lose everything, and the Whitmore name will become synonymous with corruption and fraud. The garden was silent. I could hear birds singing somewhere in the distance, utterly indifferent to the destruction unfolding below them. You're bluffing, Theodore said, but his voice shook. Am I? I turned to look at him directly. Try me. I grew up in foster care, Mr. Ashworth. I've slept in homeless shelters and eaten from food banks. I have nothing to lose and everything to gain by watching you burn. Can you say the same?
He couldn't.
We both knew it. This is extortion, Vivian hissed. No, this is justice. Long overdue. I stepped back, addressing the entire family. You have 24 hours to decide. Accept Eleanor's will and walk away clean, or fight me and face the consequences. I'll be staying at the estate tonight if you need to reach me. I turned and walked back into the house, my heart pounding so hard I was certain everyone could hear it. The next 23 hours were the longest of my life. I wandered through the estate that was now technically mine, though it didn't feel real yet. I touched the antique furniture, studied the oil paintings of ancestors I had never known, opened drawers and closets that held decades of family history. In my grandmother's bedroom, I found a hidden drawer in her vanity containing photographs of my mother at every age, from infancy to her high school graduation. Eleanor had kept them all, hidden away like contraband. I found letters too. Letters my mother had written that were never answered, returned unopened or intercepted by Vivian. Letters from Eleanor to Sarah that were never sent, drafts full of apologies and explanations that she had been too afraid to mail. In one, dated just 3 months before my mother's death, Eleanor had written, "My dearest Sarah, I know you won't read this, because I won't have the courage to send it. But I need to write the words anyway. I need you to know, even if only the paper knows, that I have loved you every day since the day you were born. Losing you was the worst thing that ever happened to me, and it was my own fault. I let them take you from me, and I have regretted it every moment since. If I could go back, I would choose differently. I would choose you. I would choose Madeline. I would choose love over fear. But I can't go back. All I can do is wait and hope and pray that somehow, someday, I will have the chance to make things right. I love you, my darling girl. I always have. I always will. Your mother." I read that letter 17 times before the tears finally stopped. I didn't hear from Vivian for 23 hours and 47 minutes. When the call finally came, it was Theodore, his voice flat and defeated. "We won't contest the will," he said, "but we want assurances that the documents will never be released." "The documents will stay in my possession," I replied. "As long as you keep your end of the bargain, no one ever needs to see them. But if you try anything, if you come after me legally, financially, or personally, everything goes public. Do we understand each other?" A long pause.
Yes.
"We understand." "Good. Harold will be in touch about the transfer of assets. Goodbye, Theodore." I hung up before he could respond. The months that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, asset transfers, and media attention. The news of Eleanor Whitmore's surprising will had leaked, as these things always do, and I found myself at the center of a story I never asked to be part of. Mystery heir inherits Whitmore fortune. From foster care to $200 million, the Cinderella story of Madeline Harper. Bitter family feud. Wealthy aunt loses everything to abandon niece. I gave one interview to a journalist I trusted and told the truth. Not about the crimes. I had made a deal, and I would keep it, but about my mother, my grandmother, and the years of estrangement that had defined my life. "I didn't want revenge," I said when asked about Vivian. "I just wanted to be acknowledged.
To be seen."
My grandmother gave me that in the end. That's worth more than any amount of money. It wasn't entirely true, of course. The money mattered. Not for what it could buy, but for what it represented. Vindication. Proof that my mother had been right all along, that her family's rejection had been about their cruelty, not her worth. But some truths are too complicated for interviews. I kept my job as a social worker for 6 more months, until it became clear that my new responsibilities required full-time attention. I hired a team of financial advisors and lawyers, people Harold recommended who had no connection to the Ashworth family. Together, we restructured the Whitmore business empire, divesting from industries I found objectionable and investing in causes I believed in. The Whitmore Charitable Foundation was completely overhauled. I brought in independent auditors, transparent accounting, and a new mission focused on supporting foster children and families in crisis. The $8 million that Vivian and Theodore had stolen was recovered through anonymous donations that I strongly suspected came from their personal accounts, a final concession to avoid exposure. I turned the family estate into a retreat center for foster youth aging out of the system, a place where they could come to learn life skills, receive counseling, and feel, even if just for a week, what it was like to belong somewhere beautiful. The renovation took 8 months. I kept the bones of the house, the history and the grandeur, but transformed its purpose entirely. The formal dining room became a communal kitchen where young people could learn to cook. The library was stocked with books on everything from college applications to financial literacy. The guest houses were converted into dormitories, each room personalized and warm, nothing like the institutional spaces I remembered from my own childhood. I hired staff who understood trauma, who had lived it themselves, who could look a scared 18-year-old in the eye and say, "I know exactly how you feel and mean it." I brought in counselors, job coaches, college advisors, all the resources I had never had access to, and made them available to anyone who walked through the doors. The most expensive addition was the scholarship fund. I set aside $50 million, carefully invested, to provide college tuition for foster youth who had aged out of the system. The first class of 20 recipients was announced on what would have been my mother's 50th birthday. I named it Sarah's House, after my mother. The opening ceremony was held on a crisp autumn day, exactly 1 year after Eleanor's funeral. Social workers, foster care advocates, and young people from across the state gathered on the grounds where I had once been told I didn't belong. I stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd, and thought about all the paths that had led to this moment. My mother used to tell me that family isn't about blood, I said. It's about who shows up for you, who fights for you, who loves you even when it's hard. By that definition, I didn't have much family growing up. But standing here today, looking at all of you, I realize I have more family than I ever imagined. I paused, composing myself. This house was built by people who believed that legacy mattered more than love. They were wrong. Legacy is just a story we tell about the past. Love is what we build for the future. I looked toward the portrait of my grandmother that hung in the main hall, visible through the open doors. Eleanor Whitmore wasn't a perfect woman. She made mistakes that hurt people I loved. But in the end, she tried to make things right. She gave me the tools to build something meaningful from the ruins of a family that lost its way. I hope, wherever she is, that she's proud of what we've created here. I raise my glass
To Sarah.
to Eleanor, and to every child who has ever been told they don't belong. This house is yours now. Welcome home. The applause washed over me like a wave. Later that evening, after the guests had left and the caterers had cleaned up, I walked through the empty halls of Sarah's house, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I stopped in front of the safe, still hidden behind the portrait, still containing the evidence that could destroy what remained of the Ashworth family. I had thought about destroying it, burning the papers, erasing the recordings, letting the past stay buried. It would have been the merciful thing to do. But mercy, I had learned, was a privilege earned through accountability. Vivian and Theodore had never been held accountable for anything. They had lived their entire lives facing no consequences, hurting people without fear of reprisal. So, I kept the documents. Not as a weapon, but as a reminder. A reminder that justice isn't always immediate, that sometimes it takes years, decades, for the truth to catch up with those who think they're above it. And a reminder to myself that I had survived them. Not just survived, but thrived. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I saw the news about Sarah's house. Your mother would be proud. I'm sorry for everything.
V.
I stared at the message for a long time. Part of me wanted to respond, to engage, to either accept the apology or reject it definitively. But I had learned something important over the past year. Not every message deserves an answer. Some people reach out not because they've changed, but because they can't stand being forgotten. I deleted the text and slipped my phone back into my pocket. Outside, the sun was setting over the lake, painting the water in shades of gold and amber. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear laughter from the first group of young people who had arrived early for the retreat. I thought about my mother, who had chosen love over comfort and paid for it with everything she had. I thought about my grandmother, who had waited too long to be brave but had found her courage in the end. And I thought about myself, the foster child who had been told she was nothing, standing in a mansion that now bore her mother's name. "You were right, Mom," I whispered into the evening air. "Grandma was a good woman. She just needed someone to show her how." The wind carried my words away, toward the lake, toward the sky, toward whatever comes after we're gone. I turned and walked back inside, ready to begin the next chapter of a story I was finally writing for myself.
Some families are bound by blood. Others are bound by choice.
I had learned, the hard way, that the families we choose are always stronger than the families we're born into. And standing in the house my grandmother had given me, surrounded by the legacy my mother had died for, I knew exactly which family I belonged to. The one I was building, one rescued child at a time.